Hey everyone, RogueGold here, and today I want to talk about farming because out of all of the questions I receive here on the channel, you might be surprised to hear that farming is one of, if not the most asked about topic. How to farm gear, where to farm gear, how do I get this item, is this exclusive, etc. And I always do my best to answer people, but I figured it's probably time for a farming guide. So that's what we're doing here today. I'm going to cover just about everything you could hope to know when it comes to farming in the Division 2, talking about concepts of loot pools, what is and isn't exclusive, drop rates, item quality, farming location suggestions, absolutely everything. So hopefully that sounds useful. If so, a like would be immensely appreciated on the video, and be sure to click that subscribe button because nearly 80% of y'all who watch are not subscribed, so what are you waiting for? You know you want to stay in the loop with everything Division, and this is the place to be for it. Also, don't forget to turn on that notification bell so that you don't miss out on any of my future uploads. I do want to note that I have left timestamps down below in case you are trying to brush up on a particular aspect of gear farming. However, if you are trying to get a better understanding of the concept as a whole, I have structured this to be a bit more chronological and build on things as we go, so skip around at your own risk. But without further ado, let's get into this. And where I want to begin is with the concept of loot pools, because I think a big misconception with this game is that certain categories of items are sectioned off to different types of content, and that there are, quote, better ways to get items than others, and for the most part, that's really not true. So let's begin with the concept of the general loot pool, which is a term you might hear myself and many others use from time to time. For all intents and purposes, the general loot pool is where all items reside. There are select exceptions, and we will get to that, but first I want you to view all loot as within this general loot pool, because I will see a lot of people say, how do I get this exotic, or how do I get this weapon? The majority of items in this game don't have sectioned off loot tables. They're all in the general loot pool. Now, what does that mean? Well, the general loot pool is applied to every piece of content in the game. Every single enemy drops loot from the general loot pool, every control point, countdown objective, raid boss, everything. Alright? Now, we will touch on how difficulty and other things affect your drop chances, right? But when someone asks what's the best way to get a FAMAS, well, you can play anything, literally, because they're all a part of the general loot pool. Now, don't worry, we're going to go much more in depth with that and talk about how to target specific types of items, but the concept of the general loot pool is a very important one to understand. Another important concept to understand is what is exempt from the general loot pool, because while the vast majority of items that are in the game are in this general loot pool, there are a few noteworthy exceptions. Now, do be warned, there are like really obscure random items here and there that have exclusive drop sources. I'm not going to be able to cover each and every single one here, so if there's an obscure item you're trying to find out about, search its name online and I guarantee you will easily find info about it. That said, there are really three major exceptions from the general loot pool: the Dark Zone loot pools, the raid and legendary loot pools, and seasons/quests. Let's start with the first one there, the Dark Zone. Now, as with everything else, the general loot pool applies to the Dark Zone. All of the same gear that you can get in there, you can also get in the DZ. However, it also has its own special pool that layers on top of that, and this mostly applies to named high-end items, because in the Division 2's endgame, there are two categories of named items: those that drop in the Dark Zone, and those that drop everywhere else. So I'm going to put a list up on screen of all of the DZ exclusive named items, that way you know which ones are in there, and if you don't see the name here of one you're looking for, then you'll know it is available everywhere else in the game and you cannot get it in the Dark Zone. Additionally, there are a few other methods to acquiring DZ exclusive named items. One, you can get them out of named caches, whether you get that from a project, a global event, whatever it may be, you can get those items there. You can get them out of conflict caches. They are also in the countdown vendor rotation, so you'll see them in that inventory every so often. And if a specific named item was introduced with a season prior to it entering the DZ loot pool, you can get it out of legacy season caches. To find out whether that is applicable to whatever item you may be pursuing, I advise searching its name online and seeing what you can find there. Alright, with that down, there is one other aspect to cover of the Dark Zone loot pool, and that is the recent addition that you can now also acquire some previously raid and legendary exclusive exotic items in there. Those being the Eagle Bearer, Ravenous, and Bighorn. You'll still have a much higher chance playing those original drop source content, but you do have a small chance to receive these items in the Dark Zone as well. Speaking of raids and legendaries, let us move on to those activities loot pools. Once more, the general loot pool does still apply to these. Any item you can get in the general loot pool, you can also get here. However, there are a few additional things that layer on top of that are exclusive to raid and legendary content. Those are the Eagle Bear exotic assault rifle from the Dark Hours raid, the Ravenous exotic rifle from the Iron Horse raid, and the Bighorn exotic assault rifle from legendary missions and legendary difficulty summit. Again, aside from the Dark Zone, which we talked about just a moment ago, those items items will only drop from those sources, and even once you acquire them for the first time, they won't start dropping anywhere else. Which is important to mention because lastly we move on to seasons and quests because they have interesting interactions when it comes to the general loot pool. Let's start with seasons. Any new seasonal items, whether it be new weapons, the brand set, named items, as soon as the season begins, they enter the general loot pool. So it doesn't matter if you pull one from the season track or you just find it out in the open world, they are out there from the start. The one exception to this rule is exotics. For instance, Season 11 is the current in-game update as of the making of this video, and it brought with it the Ninja Bike exotic backpack and the Sacrum Imperium exotic marksman rifle. In the case of seasonal exotics, you will not find them out in the general loot pool until you first acquire them via the season track. Now, if you're playing with somebody who has gotten it from the track and they happen to get an additional one to drop while they're playing with you, they could share it with you, but you can only acquire your first copy of that exotic from the season track. After that, it will be in your general loot pool, and then you can farm it to your delight. Additionally, once that season concludes, so to use the same example here, once Season 11 ends in a few weeks' time, the Ninja Bike and the Sacrum Imperium will enter the general loot pool for everybody, regardless of if you obtained it during that season or not. So for instance, even though the Memento was an exotic introduced in the Season 3 reward track years ago, it's no longer Season 3, right? So even if you've never had one, it is out there in the general loot pool for you to collect. So that is the rule with seasons, and that will presumably continue into Year 5 in the future. Shifting over to quests, there is a similar rule set here. A certain number of exotics in the game were first introduced via a quest line or a project or some sort of achievement, right? I'll throw a list of those specific items up on screen, and if you're wondering how to obtain those projects or complete them, I once again refer you to the wonders of the internet. There are tons and tons of guides out there on how to do so, but if you have not done those specific quests, then those items will not be out in your general loot pool to farm. Once you do those quests, however, the item will then be in your general loot pool if you wish to farm further copies. This includes exotic caches, and again, if you were to be playing with somebody who has completed the project before, they could share a drop with you of one of those items, even if you had not done the project yourself before. Alright, I believe and hope that explains the majority of loot pools and exclusivity with loot in the game. I know that was a lot, likely there are some additional roles and tiny details that I missed, but at least on a broad stroke, that is how it all works. You might be wondering though, alright, well that's great, but it sounds like the general loot pool is pretty vast. How am I supposed to narrow it down and target what I'm looking for? Well, I'm glad you asked. In comes targeted loot. You may have heard of this before, may not have. What does it mean? Well, if you open your mega map, you will see a prompt at the bottom to show targeted loot selections. And by clicking that, you will suddenly see an array of icons across your map. At a base level, targeted loot is a system that rotates daily, and it assigns a category of loot to every open world zone, dark zone, and main mission within the game. So let's say that one day the Providence brand set is the target in Dark Zone South, then the next day it's at the Space Administration mission, and the day after it's in the Constitutional Hall open world zone. What this means is by playing that content, a higher frequency of your loot drops will be of that specific category. This is why you will often hear me say, when people ask me how do I get the Memento backpack, for example, I'll say, well, it's in the general loot pool, so you can get it anywhere, but you will have the best chances by playing content that has targeted backpacks, because you're more likely to get a backpack drop there as opposed to anywhere else. And that's really it. It's a simple system, but a very effective one as far as being able to focus on what you're trying to get. There are a few clarifications to add here. Targeted loot does influence those separate loot pools that we discussed previously. So for example, if you're trying to farm a Dark Zone exclusive named item, let's say the Gift Providence backpack, for example, and one day it is targeted backpacks in the Dark Zone, then yeah, get in there. You have a much better chance at picking it up. Targeted loot does not apply to a few specific activities within the game, namely raids, Kenley College, so just keep that in mind. And additionally, there are a few pieces of content in the game that allow you to choose your own targeted loot, so don't worry, we'll circle back around to that when we cover some of my farming recommendations. Alright, so now we've got the concept of loot pools down, we know how to narrow that down with targeted loot. Well, what about drop chances and item quality? Does playing easier or harder content influence any of that? Let's take a moment and talk about difficulty within the game. As you likely know, the game features several levels of difficulty at the end game: normal, hard, challenging, heroic, and legendary. Now those first four can be changed and applied to practically any content, the open world, missions, strongholds, etc. And of course, legendary is a bit more limited. Now the answer is yes, difficulty does influence farming, but maybe not in the ways you would think. Here is how the game handles it. The only drop chance increase that difficulty level provides is for exotic. So if you're playing on hard versus normal or heroic versus normal, each level you go up in difficulty provides a passive buff to your chance for an exotic to drop. no matter what content you're playing. Aside from that, however, difficulty does not influence drop rates. You should receive the same amount of drops on normal as you would on heroic, RNG willing that is. What difficulty does have a greater influence on, however, is item quality. Now, it is still possible to get god rolls on normal. Yes it is. What difficulty does, however, is it raises the minimum possible stat roll for an item that you get to drop. So for example, and keep in mind these are just hypothetical numbers as I don't know the actual values, but for example, let's say that normal difficulty has a 10% minimum roll cap. That means that when an item drops, its stats could be as low as 10% or they could be all the way up at 100%. So you can still get god rolls, but there is a wider range, meaning on average your items probably won't be as high in quality. Bump that up to hard difficulty, now the minimum cap is 30%, still wide, but you're probably going to get slightly better stuff. Challenging, it goes to 50%, heroic 70, legendary 90. Again, those are all hypothetical numbers, those are not the actual values, but that is how item quality is handled. You can get god rolls on the lowest difficulty, but the game is designed to, on average, provide you with better items the higher difficulty you play on. In case you're wondering, directives do not have any influence on loot drop chances or quality. They affect XP gain only. The only exception for that is within the Summit game mode, and we'll touch on that shortly. Alright. For the most part, that is everything. That is how the Division 2 handles loot tables, focused farming, drop chances, and quality. You may still be wondering, however, that's all great, but where are the best places to farm? Because while you can play anything to get anything, doing Grand Washington Hotel on loop trying to get a Coyote's mask might not be the most efficient, right? So there are two experiences and spots within the game that I want to highlight here for their uniqueness and viability as farming spots. Let's start with Countdown. I'm sure many of you know it, but Countdown is an 8-player endgame mode. It runs in quick 15-minute sessions, and I think it provides you by far the most amount of loot per time spent in the entire game. I mean, in one session, it's easy to pick up 40 to 50 pieces of loot. That's a lot. Now, Countdown does have normal through heroic versions. The same item quality scaling applies. You can also play it on solo on those lower difficulties if you prefer. But for me, whenever I'm trying to get a specific item, I do Countdown runs at challenging difficulty with a full match-made team. I think it provides a great balance of difficulty and reward, and it's just a lot of fun. But what is probably the biggest highlight here is that Countdown is one of the 2 spots in the game that allows you to select your own targeted loot. Either before you go in or once you enter the mode, you can open your map and you'll see an option at the bottom to open up the table, and bam, a fully selectable range of loot categories are there to choose from. There are no restrictions, limitations, nothing. Choose what you want to target and get 50 pieces of loot from that in 15 minutes. It's fantastic. So, Countdown is a big recommendation from me. Additionally though, let's talk about the Summit game mode. Now, the Summit is the other spot in the game where you can choose your own targeted loot. It has the exact same table selection, and in general, I would say Summit is a bit more of a solo and casual friendly experience. There's no timer, no pressure. You can choose to even play it on Legendary if you prefer, which is fun. And while I wouldn't say it is quite as efficient as Countdown is for loot, it does have one thing that makes it stand out, and that is the fact that in Summit only, and this applies nowhere else in the game, each directive you apply to your run increases the chance for targeted loot to drop. I believe the way it works is that it doesn't actually affect the chance for an item to drop, but it increases the chances that when an item drops, it comes with an additional targeted loot piece. Regardless, however, this mechanic is exclusive to the Summit mode, so if you like Summit or if it works for you and you're able to comfortably run a few directives, it can be another great spot to run through and get a bunch of loot of your choosing, again, since you're able to select your own target. That's it, everybody. I think that is about everything I can add to this guide to get you fully up to speed on gear farming in the Division 2. It can be confusing as this stuff isn't very clearly outlined in the game itself, so I really hope this was useful and helped you gain a better understanding of how all of these systems work, and hopefully it can go to good use. Please do let me know any and all of your thoughts and questions below. It is pretty much inevitable that I missed some details in here, maybe even had 1 or 2 of my own pieces of info wrong. I like to think I know a lot about this game, and I researched beforehand to try and fact check all of my information, but I know there are much smarter people out there than me, so don't be afraid to critique or revise down below. And also, if you have any tips or knowledge to share with people in this realm, certainly leave that down there too. And lastly, if you have any questions regarding this information, ask away and I will do my best to answer. That's all I've got for today, everybody. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. RogueGold.